You're welcome.
There we go.
So you are started, you are being recorded. Folks aren't seeing it just yet, and we are starting to populate. We've got already 20 people attending. 20.
They get seats at the front.
That's right.
All right, there we go. All right, so we should be live. All right, well, hello everybody. We are going to have a slow roll for a minute here and let everybody else come in through Zoom. We can see the numbers as they tick up. We also know there was only about 9 minutes between that closing or that last session and right now. So glad to have you here, and we're going to get started in about a minute. Looks like we should probably have 100 or 200 folks joining us today, which is a great number. And perfect. Let me start off by introducing myself. I'm Brian Meyer. I'm co-director for the Midwest PBIS. Today be with you throughout the day on the Getting Started strand and this first session for using data for decision making. And my co-presenter today is Heather. Heather, can you say hi?
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Oh, Heather George, and I'm co-direct the National Center on PBIS as well as Florida's PBIS project. And I'm super excited to have all of you here. And we've got a great strand set up for you.
Let's go through some housekeeping stuff, and that can give folks a few more minutes to log in here. So for this strand today, we're going to spend the next 75 minutes focused on getting started and data. You can help you by focusing on our expectations for the forum. So these are to be responsible, be kind, and be safe. Really focus on the language you're using for in chat especially. I think that's where you'll to demonstrate, especially being kind would be great. You can find your sessions. You're already here, of course, but you guys know how to navigate Pathable already. If this is the first session that you're jumping into, on the left-hand side, you see the video. On the right-hand side, you'll see chat, polls, files, and people, and you can navigate our content there as well. Questions can be entered in a poll. You'll see that as well. And you also might be able to put some questions in chat too. We'll talk about that more after this introduction. Be careful. You might click and navigate away from the system. If you do, just go back to your sessions, enter it again, and you'll be back with us. And if you have any technical issues, it's hard for us to manage that with a couple hundred friends on chat. So you can use that help desk link at the top. And we have some folks standing by live to assist you. And it looks like we're about 3 minutes in. So let's talk about our norms. What we're doing that's a little unique for these strands are Heather and I invited our colleagues, Diane, Brian, and Therese to be chat panelists. They have a lot of great experience with this work. And so they're going to monitor chat in Pathable or in our application here. And as we get engaged with different ideas and content, they're going to jump in and help answer questions and give some of their thoughts and ideas. So you can help us by when you use chat, especially if you're posing a question, it would be great if you could include your district name and your state and maybe your position, because that makes a difference. If you're asking a question from a state team perspective or a district team, if you're a clinician or if you're a building administrator, those can help us, especially in the context of Diane, Brian, and Teresa responding to you. Okay, so those are the ways and the norms we like to put in place for using chat. Let's talk about PBIS, the big ideas. I think it was Don who kicked off this idea of using the bicycle as a metaphor for this work, and it's amazing. You can have all of the parts that you need for your school and all the things that excite you, like you see that bicycle on in pieces there. You need to have a framework, something to bring it all together. And over the course of the day today, we're going to get into these topics, this idea of coaching the work or steering the bike, the interventions, kind of where the rubber meets the road, doing the work with the kids, having the team, who's sitting down, who's making decisions, the framework, which is, or the frame of the bicycle, which is data-based decision-making. That'll make Diane happy. She likes anytime you can say the word data. School leadership are the gears on the back, and changing the pace at which we move sometimes. And then implementation, what's driving all of this? The pedals. I love the metaphor, it's perfect. And it's a good way for us to sort of get going today. Also, you'll see this idea that we've shared in our sort of getting back to school guides, which is how can you create safe, positive, predictable learning environments? And what are the key components there? So connect with your youth and your staff, screen to figure out what you need, provide support based on what you learned from that screening, teach, be direct with your instruction, and then monitor. So that's another way of looking at the work of PBIS. I don't know if anybody saw this on October 19th. This was published from the U.S. Department of Education, and it was a formal publication. Multiple technical assistance centers provided input into it, coming out of the Office of Special Education Programs. And the publication is called Supporting Child, Student, Social, Emotional, Behavioral, and Mental Health Needs. And this is a milestone publication. It is worth every 100 pages if you can dig into it and read it. If you are seeing it for the first time, take a look at these recommendations the U.S. Department of Ed is suggesting. Each one of these are at the foundation of the work that we've done at the center for the past 15 to 20 years. And I want to highlight especially that in order to help students socially, emotionally, behaviorally, you should establish an integrated framework to organize your school. And that's what the work is today. When we're talking about getting started with PBIS, it's the framework. It's how are you going to put, what's the glue that's going to hold all of this together? I can't say enough how exciting this document is. There's so much in there that you should break down. And whether you're new or experienced, it's definitely worth the time. Let's also talk about kind of where you are in terms of this work. Are you at the start? Are you in the middle? Is this a reboot opportunity? Do you know PBIS, or you knew it 20 years ago and now you need to dig in again and look at the fidelity of the work? Something to know about our experience in education is this idea of about a 4-year cycle for innovations in education, the enthusiasm, the implementation, and then the drop off until something new. And we see that time and time again. Whatever your priorities are in the school, give it a 4-year timeline and see where they'll be 4 years from now. And we've said for a long time that in PBIS, it takes 3 to 5 years to implement this with Fidelity. Well, that's right in that sweet spot. Rob Horner started shifting some of that language many years ago and said, don't do anything in your schools unless it's going to be important to you for the next 10 years. And I like that framing as well. And what we've known, even though there is that 4-year life cycle, throughout the past 20 plus years, PBIS has been continually relevant. And the reason is because the framework at its core is simple and straightforward. This is the most concise definition I can write about what is PBIS. So it organizes your school to achieve outcomes through understanding your data, providing a continuum of practices, supporting staff through systems, and prioritizing equity throughout. You can't get fewer words together. And while it might be easy to define in this case, it doesn't mean that school change is easy. So that's what we're going to, again, dig into today. So what do those components mean that I just kind of quickly rattled off? When we're talking about outcomes, it's your outcomes. What's important to you and your school community? Social competence and academic achievement is sort of the broad category of what we would start with. And you're going to define that specifically. What are the outcomes that you are currently getting and or that you want to get? When we talk about data, we're talking about supporting decision-making across all of these components. Using data to see where you're at, using data to progress monitor, using data to see what you've accomplished. Practices are how adults interact with students. And that's where I kind of hid that little triangle there, that idea of multiple tiers. What are we doing for all students? What are the practices that we layer on top for students who need additional doses of support? What are the practices then that we further individualize for students who need intense support for any specific social, emotional, behavioral skills? And finally, systems. Those are the components of our school structure that best support adults. Other language that's become very commonly heard across the country is the idea of a multi-tiered system of supports, or MTSS. And if we're in the US and you look at 50 states, there's about 50 different ways that this is being tweaked and identified in each state. I like these 6 components taken from the McIntosh and Goodman publication in 2016. Yours might be a little bit different, but they're probably similar enough. So when we talk about MTSS, know 80% of the research that went into MTSS come out of this foundational work in PBIS. And PBIS then becomes the social emotional behavioral MTSS framework. So you take these 6 components, and this is how they would layer on. Under systems, how we support our adults, what we're talking about is team-based leadership and coordination. And then we're talking about the process of providing professional development, coaching, and content expertise. 2 of those components of MTSS. When we talk about data, the MTSS components are evaluating the fidelity of your system and your practices, progress monitoring, and then universal screening. What do we need to focus on for our whole community? Which students need additional doses or more intense supports? And then under practices, that is this 3-tiered continuum of culturally relevant, evidence-based interventions. What are we doing for all? What do we layer for some? What do we individualize for few? So some big messages, big principles when we're talking about these components of PBIS. Equity. You can see equities in the middle. It crosses everything. Equity is not just the outcomes that you get and are they equitable, it's the processes and inputs we put in. It's the representation of our decision-making groups. So equity should be evident across all of this work. This is for all students, all families, all educators. It's always important to include your staff when you're talking about these outcomes. The framework helps you differentiate supports. That's this idea of tiered interventions. We want to make sure that the students are central to all decision making. So this is for all, and how is it impacting the students? Student outcomes should reflect equitable learning opportunities, and equity should be part of the ultimate criteria for the decisions that you're making. When it comes to those practices, you're better off picking a few and implementing them well than having a smorgasbord of practices. Integrate and align your practices. How many of you are working on PBIS, but you also have restorative practices and second step curriculum taking place and a bullying prevention initiative? And oh, we're going to have a book study on racism in America. You're doing all of these things, align and integrate. One framework, pick the framework and use that and bring those important ideas into that framework. Data should inform decision-making for all, and invest in those systems to support the high fidelity of implementation across time. Don't make this a 4-year project. Make sure this is existing for at least 10. If you do this well, we have evidence, clear evidence through the last 20 plus years and randomized control trials showing Outcomes for schools that implement with Fidelity have increased academic performance, increased social, emotional, behavioral competence, increased social and academic outcomes for students with disabilities, reduction in bullying behaviors, decreased rates of student-reported substance abuse. We know schools that implement with Fidelity have reduced exclusionary discipline practices. We know that schools that implement with Fidelity have improved teacher outcomes. Perception of teacher efficacy. I love that one. The parents will feel, and the community will feel, that your teachers are more effective because of how you've organized your school. So this is the threshold. It's not just, hey, PBIS is on our to-do list, but we're doing it to Fidelity. And if we can get there, when you compare yourself to other schools that are similar, these should be the outcomes that you see. Okay, so let's help organize this in sort of a logical rollout and show you where data fits in all of this. This is one way that we like to organize it. So start with teaming. Who's on the team? Who's making decisions? Is it shared leadership? Have that team that's representative of your community decide what is the vision for our school and how are we going to define that through 3 to 5 expectations. Once you have the vision, now let's task analyze it. What does that vision look like in the classrooms? What does that look like on the way to school before the bell rings? What does that look like in our after school programs? If you've defined your vision and you've task analyzed it, how students can show it through their social, emotional, behavioral skills, now we need to teach. So what's the lesson plans and the curriculum you're going to use to teach the skills to achieve the vision? It's once we've achieved those components, that those are in place, now we can talk about that system for feedback. How are you going to give students specific praise for feedback about what you've taught, about what's taught and connected back to the school-wide vision? How about when students have behavioral errors or need more support or intentionally say, I'm not interested in following the rules today? We need a process then by which adults define that behavior the same way and have a consistent way of responding to the behavior. And then finally, what's the data that informs all of these processes? So that's the process. If you're familiar with how we measure fidelity in PBIS at Tier 1, we use something called the Tiered Fidelity Inventory. And you can see how all of those components, those 15 components of Tier 1, map onto that process. Today, we're going to start with database decision-making. And that's what we're going to dig into. So you can see I'll move all those components to the side. We'll sort of leave them up as we present throughout the day. We're going to be prioritizing database decision-making. And if you're familiar with the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, it's items 1.12, 13, 14, and 15, especially. Okay. If you haven't done so already, now is a great time for you to go over to the polls tab. And while we do this, I'm going to stop sharing and Heather will pull up her screen. Go over to the polls tab and answer these 4 questions about where your school, or if you're a district administrator, in generally your district, where are they at with these ideas? So we'll give you a minute to do that. Heather, let me go ahead and stop sharing. All right, good. We can see your screen, Heather.
Okay, and while you guys are completing the polls, we're going to be looking at the results, and just know that we'll be reporting back on those results towards the end of this session too. So, and I know it might take a little bit to answer them. We're going to keep talking because we have a lot of information to cover. To give you guys a heads up, this is something that we have typically done in 2 full sessions. We've realized, you know what, getting started has so much information. And it's so important to hear directly from the voices of folks that we have invited exemplars across the 3 sessions within this Getting Started strand to be able to answer questions directly to you in the chat box while we're presenting. They may even have opportunity, depending on time, because we've got a lot of people that are in this session, to turn their microphones on to answer answer direct questions. But rather than taking time like for one person providing the exemplar situation, you're going to have the opportunity to pick their brain while we're going and talking specifically about data today, because the exemplars are going to change across each of the 3 sessions that we have in this strand. So you'll be able to pick their brain, ask specific questions. And if you're not putting questions in, trust me, they're going to start to possibly ask you guys questions in the chat box. So we hope that you guys will really take advantage of this great opportunity. So let me talk to you about our first presenter. And Therese, would you like to hop on so they can see you? But here's some background information about Therese, and she is going to be one of the people behind the scenes answering your questions.
Hey everybody, my name's Therese Sandomierski. I actually work with Heather. I'm a technical assistance specialist with Florida's PBIS project. I started with the project back in 2002 as a graduate assistant and came on full-time as a technical assistant specialist in 2006. Since then, I've provided training and technical assistance to districts in almost every corner of our state, depending how you think about the different corners. So I've been able to see a whole variety of schools with a whole variety of data systems at all different starting points in their journey towards implementation. So thank you all for having me, and I hope you enjoy the session.
Thanks, Therese. And our next exemplar, Brian.
Hi, good morning, everyone. And I'm also with the Florida PBIS project as a technical assistant specialist, working mostly with districts in the southern Florida tip of the state. And I've been with the project since 2010. Prior to that, with the Florida RTI project, where I served as a regional coordinator and helped with statewide implementation of our Florida problem-solving process across our school districts. And so I'm very happy to be here and welcome, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Sorry. Thanks, Brian and Diane. Didn't realize I was muted.
No worries. Good morning. It's good to have everybody here with us in this session. I am Diane Lemaster with the Midwest PBIS Network as a technical assistance coordinator and trainer. I have been involved with PBIS for 20 plus years, implementing at a building level, at a district level, 3 tiers of supports for students. So lots of years of experience. My specialty within the network is all things Swiss and TIPS. So I am a national trainer and facilitator of Swiss and school-wide information system, as well as TIPS, the problem-solving process and model. So that it's kind of, I'm that go-to person within our network for all things data. And so this is a perfect place for me to be, and I'm thrilled to be here and hope you enjoy the session. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And welcome, Diane. So, and welcome exemplars. And so again, everybody, if anything comes up, any question whatsoever during this session, please make sure to put that in the chat box because we really want to be able to use this time to pick their brain, to hear firsthand directly from them some of the issues, barriers they've come up with, some of the enablers they've been able to work through. And I guarantee if you've had that question, somebody else has had that question too. So I think this is a great opportunity. Just as a reminder, if you do put something and you have a specific question, you put that in the chat box. Please make sure if you're coming from a district to identify your district name and add the state it's from, because we all don't know which, say, independent school district is coming from what state. And then maybe your position, and that will help them determine which of the 3 will be answering your questions as we're going. I'm also going to try to monitor the chat box while we're talking about using data for decision making so that, and they may interrupt me occasionally too if I miss something. But essentially, sometimes folks wonder when they're talking about those 3 circles that Brian covered with you, they wonder, you know, which one do I start with? Do I start with the practices? Do I start with the data? Do I start with the systems piece? And I think for folks that have gotten fluent in the PBIS framework and the implementation, particularly at tier 1, they there's all different ways that you can start, and there's no one right way. But one of the things we do always like to say is, well, what do your data say? So before you go and invest in establishing the PBIS framework and looking at establishing a core across for your school campus, you want to say, like, what do our data tell us? And that starts to help you determine and generate an action plan. So one of the things I'm curious for you, whether you're coming from a state level, you're coming from a district, and you're thinking of many schools potentially implementing or that are starting to implement within your district, or you're at that school level and you're thinking, how do I get this going right now within my school? So one of the things I'd like to hear from you guys, if you can put it quickly in the chat box, is right now, does your team review or analyze data? And I'm curious, again, this should probably be a poll, but we didn't think of it that way. But to think about, are we analyzing, looking at our data at every single team meeting? Are we doing it at least 2 times a year? Are we doing it at the beginning? So I'm just curious what you guys have to say about that. And I did see that somebody said they love data, so that's great. I think you're in the right session. So looking at the chat. All right, so there's at least 3 times a year. There's some folks that are saying not regularly. And you know what? It's important to have an honest assessment of that, because we can't ever figure out how do we improve if we don't know exactly where we are. So talking about understanding data, you know, there's various purposes for it. So there's evaluation purposes for that, and that there's the summative. It helps us with our overall decisions. You know, should we, you know, do this? Is it working? Do we need to abandon it? Do we need to modify it? Then there's times we go in and provide, there's those formative types of data, which can help us determine, is it implemented as intended? Is it improving the outcomes as intended? And then accountability, you know, determining are people actually adhering to procedures, policies, practices from there. So there's all different ways that we can use data for our evaluation purposes. I think overall, it's important for us to know when we're looking at tier 1, we're thinking of that overall kind of screening process. And it doesn't necessarily mean instantly we're going to be doing a social emotional screener. However, if you did, which is a great thing, that is something that is a tier 1 data process, because you are starting to gather data across all students across your entire campus. But the data can also help us determine for those students which ones are not responding well, and help us in that diagnosis to determine who needs more intensive supports. Data also can help us in that progress monitoring piece to say, hey, based on what we've come up with, is it working? Is it making a difference? Rather than waiting towards the end of the year to say, did we do better than last year or not so good? At that point, it's too hard to make changes live in that process. Then you got to just gear up and hopefully prevent for the next school year. But it's so important that we understand why and what purpose the data are being collected. And it needs to be meaningful to you. It needs to be meaningful for the folks that are helping to contribute in the data collection. And overall who are completing the data. So if you did have screeners, it's important for the kids to know, why is this information being collected? What's going to come out of this? Again, having that meaning, that purpose behind it can help it make it less of a paperwork compliance task. So looking at that overall continuum of assessment, you know, we're looking at school-wide screening. And so, like I said, I may not be talking a formal screener at this point yet. Screeners do fall into this category, but I think another way to also look at is who is responding to what we have set up on campus and who's not responding. And sometimes our basic just office discipline referral data can give us some indications with that. But also we have to know not all of our kids generate office discipline referrals. Not all of our kids have externalizing behavior issues. Not all teachers send kids to the office. The takeaway is that not to say we need to send more kids to the office so we get accurate data. The takeaway is, how are we gathering and figuring out how are kids doing out there across the board based upon our expectations that we've got set up? How effective are we in providing our supports across campus? What supports are indicated, and what can students do? Why can they do that? Why can't some students do that? And it starts to help you in that problem solving process. That other continuum starts to move into that progress monitoring piece of saying, how effective If there's an intervention that we're doing, say in the cafeteria, how effective are we in that process, rather than, again, waiting towards the end of the year? And then evaluations at final, how did we do overall? So some of the examples of data collected, is the fidelity of systems. So overall, when we're talking about our tier 1 across the board, that data, when we're looking at our system, you could use the benchmarks equality, which assesses just tier 1. There's the TFI, which is the tiered fidelity inventory, which Brian had talked to you a little bit already there, but that tiered fidelity inventory can assess all of your tiers from not only tier 1, but tier 2 and tier 3 if you chose. And there's other tools as well that can help you determine, have we established a system and do we continue to support that system with fidelity as it was designed? But then there's also the piece of practices. So just because we set up a system, we actually have to have some evidence-based practices that we're using on our school campus. So you'd want to know, like, are we actually implementing these interventions that we've committed to, or that we've paid a lot of money for on our school campus? Are we implementing them as they were designed and as intended? And so there's different types of ways to assess that as well. And then another way of looking at our data is to look at our overall outcome data. It could be your office discipline referrals that are happening per week, that are happening per month, at the end of the school year, but you also want to look at your attendance data. You want to look at the number of students that are actually being acknowledged, that are doing the correct thing on campus. Do you have data around that? Look at grades for students. If many students are failing their classes, that's a classic sign that it's a systems issue. Sometimes, as hard as we try for our lesson plans and we think it's a fantastic lesson plan, the kids don't get it, or the way we tested did not match in how we had taught them. Also, are students achieving their goals? Are we seeing that we're regaining our instructional time? There's also parent surveys. I know a lot of our schools and districts are good at maybe completing like climate surveys. They've got other types of surveys. Satisfaction. Are people happy with the supports they're getting? Are they happy with their children going to your schools? But then you could also look at, have focus groups, direct observation that you're seeing. So looking at this list of the different types of data to be collected, don't worry if you're not collecting all of them, or don't worry or panic thinking, oh my gosh, we do collect all of this. We don't look at all of it. And don't worry, most people have not always done that. And so the key is identifying, what is it that we do have data on? What questions do we have that we need to be asking ourselves, and determining where are we doing well, what are we not doing so well? And then that helps us on our next step. Some examples of that discipline referral data. Again, these look pretty fancy, but if you were interested in having these fancy graphs and entering some of the discipline referral data that do occur on your school campus, the Swiss system, if you go to that link, that is something that is available for your school to check out. But is it the average referrals per day, per month? Also looking at, what types of problems are occurring. So if you are using some of your office discipline referral data, what are the problems that are being sent to the office? What kinds of problem behavior are students exhibiting? Because that information can help us determine where we need to go in determining what practices we need to focus on. In what location are most of our problem behavior areas or problems coming from? You think about, my gosh, there's so many kids. There's a lot of minutes throughout the school day. Where do we even focus our time? But if you're able to determine and identify where most of the problems are occurring, in what location, you can focus in on that and provide that intervention in that particular area, or that particular time of day in that area. Or it might be that you're realizing it feels like there's an awful lot of problem behavior, but maybe it's just a small group of kids that are actually generating most of those referrals. Well, rather than providing massive intervention across all, maybe we need to provide more intensive intervention for these groups of kids. We also could look at referrals by day per week. I think sometimes referrals per day per month, like right before holidays, sometimes things can get a little a little wild, or even right after the holidays for things, and looking at referrals by grade. Again, you're trying to use your data to determine where are we having issues and where do we need to focus more of our supports. And then disproportionate outcomes typically are not going to be addressed unless equity is documented and a supported priority. So one of the documents that I wanted to show on the right here about identifying disproportionate discipline, that is hyperlinked. So if you were looking at either the handouts, the PDF handouts that have been uploaded, you can click on that and that will hyperlink you directly to that resource that's in the live binder on the Florida project. So talking about disproportionate outcomes, this is Teresa's alley. So if you guys have specific questions, she is the person to be putting in the chat box and asking your questions right now. On this one, I'm sure Diane and Brian would be happy to jump into, but Teresa, I think, might be salivating over this one. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe her camera's off right now, but she is somebody to definitely pick the brain over. But it's so important that we're looking, because we can see, are we being equitable in the amount of, in the discipline that we are providing across our campuses for students? And we need to sometimes look and take this hard look and say, okay, if we are not, what do we need to do differently? What's going on here? And again, we're using data to help us determine what's working and then what's not working so well, so that we have a better idea in what to do when we start PBIS and start to identify our practices and how and why we're going to focus in those areas. Talking about data sharing with staff, students, and community. This one, it's so important that we don't overlook this, because again, the last thing we want to do, and we all know there's been lots of things in our work environments, regardless of where you're working, school or district, that you've had to complete something, you've had to do something, and there's a deadline, and there's people sending you reminders to get it done, but you're not really sure why you're doing it, but you know, your boss is telling you, we have to get this done. And then sometimes you wonder, a couple weeks, couple months go by, you're like, what was that for? Did they do anything with that? What are they going to be doing with that? It's so important that our students know as well what you're doing on campus. It's so important that your staff, your faculty, if you're asking for information and you're asking them to collect data and you're asking them to let you know what's happening out there, and you're observing things across campus and you're proposing to make changes on campus, it's important that they know why. It's important that they get a read and get some feedback of, this is what we found overall. This is why we're going to be making these changes. That's an example of data-based decision-making, but it's also an example of how you keep your folks at the table, because they're going to be invested in this process and helping you implement. So I think it's important for folks to know, how are we progressing towards our goal? It might be that you guys are simply in that data gathering piece right now to figure out what areas of your school climate that you're wanting to improve and what's really needed. I think it's important that you share the Fidelity checks with them. If there's interventions and trainings that you've had them go through, and you're going through and providing observations, it's important that they get feedback on how things are going. You know, adults like knowing too if they're doing something correct. As much as we say, like, I don't need to be rewarded, you got to admit, at times adults do like to be validated. Even if they know they were doing something correct, they do like to be validated. Kids like to be acknowledged too if they've done something correct. Again, if we want the likelihood of this behavior to occur again, and if it's a positive behavior, we need to acknowledge folks about that. When we're sharing data with folks, we also need to get a read from folks out there. Does this look accurate? So I remember sitting in a high school, and the high school was trying to get their faculty on board to get excited about Tier 1 PBIS. And they hadn't even gone through training yet, but they wanted to open up the conversations to get a gauge of where their whole faculty and staff were. And the faculty were saying, we don't need to do anything else. The administration needs to do their job, and they need to discipline these kids. And the administration was saying, teachers just need to teach, and they need to stop sending the kids to the office. He's like, I'm backlogged. So he decided at a faculty meeting, I'm going to have an open conversation. And before the new school year starts out, I want to get an idea from the teachers where they think the number of tardies that we had across campus, because their current system actually had, when you're tardy to class in high school, this high school said you had to be sent to the office and you had to go get a tardy slip. So think about it. You're late to class already, so you've missed some instruction, and now you're going to be even more late by being sent to the office and getting a tardy slip, and then you enter late again. And the administration was saying this is not working. However, how do they get their folks, their teachers on board to help them on trying something new? And so from this information, they said, how many tardies do you think we had last year? And this was a school of 1,000 kids. And, you know, they had people saying like 2,000 tardies, you know, 10,000 tardies. And then one person said, okay, I'm throwing it out there, 11,000 tardies. And people were like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. The administrator said, nope, I actually have over 16,000 documented tardies. And we know not every single tardy was accurately documented last year. And he says, I've equated this to what this means of the lost instructional time if it's just 5 minutes per tardy that gets missed of instructional time. And there were years and that were lost of instructional time across this entire student body. That was enough to stop the teachers. And they said, well, this is really, we need to change. This isn't working. So think about of the data that are being sent. It's important to have conversations with folks over that, but then it also helps them determine and realize we're going to do something with these data. These data actually can be helpful for us. It might not look good right away, but the goal is, okay, we're looking at what's not looking good and what we need to do for improvement. And that'll help us track to determine, again, progress monitor. Are we making a difference as we're going? So provide feedback to folks. Let them know where you are in the process. I think another piece of data sharing is what you heard today, this morning, and even yesterday, of the voice of the students, the voice of other district folks, the voice of your teachers, the voice of your parents. Are they giving you feedback on what's working, what's not working? Again, just because it might not be a data point, that's still important data. All right, and then fidelity of implementation. So, you know, do we have schools implementing with Fidelity? Is your school implementing with Fidelity? And what it means is that it's implemented as it's intended. So that TFI that we've got established, that TFI can help us determine and build that system on our school campus for Tier 1. And we're not just guessing at what we want to do. So this was a graph, for example, that in Florida, I had administrators that would say, you know what, I'm implementing okay. We know we're just okay. And we're having some positive impact, and that's all right. And I started to hear that a lot from principals over the years. And I thought, you know what, I would like to know, at least in my state, if you're implementing with Fidelity, do you actually have better outcomes? And this was from long ago. You could see we started collecting these data back in 2009. And sure enough, you had 34% fewer office discipline referrals across years if you implemented with Fidelity. And I'm not even saying high fidelity at this point, you know, where you're having to get like 100 on the benchmarks of quality or the TFI. I'm talking about you're getting at least a 70% on either one of those. So another thing that we had found is that the average was 41% fewer days of out of school suspension if you implement it with Fidelity. And you think about that, it's like great data. That started to get a lot of administrators in Florida on board. So this is one example of our annual report. You can go there, you can click on that and see all kinds of information. But again, sometimes to help us get started is to hear data from elsewhere of what worked and the data that they used. And sometimes that will get things going in your area. So the DSFI, we've talked briefly about the TFI, which I'll be talking, or might be mentioning that again in this session, but the DSFI is specific for District Systems Fidelity Inventory. And you can click directly on this icon and it will take you straight to this tool. And it is essentially to help you set up your system at a district level for supporting PBIS. And so if you're at a school level, that'd be something to think, okay, how can I help get my district on board? What are some of the things that they might need to consider? It helps also to organize what we're doing around training, what we're doing around providing coaching supports for folks. The last thing we want to be doing is accidentally competing. And we want to make sure that we're providing resources to folks overall, so that when they do go through professional development, they are getting the supports then in the classroom and know what to do with it. So the TFI that we talked about, and again, you can click right on that and it'll take you right there. But Brian had given you earlier today that overall snapshot of where we are we implementing correctly? But essentially with the Fidelity, it means like there is a purpose in why we're setting this up. And so I think when you're looking at this graphic and you're seeing teaming and leadership involvement at the very top, typically when we're getting going on a school campus, you would go in a clockwise kind of direction. So the next thing would be, okay, we've got some folks together as a team. We're going to develop our vision and expectations. We're going to define rules. We're going to set up our system for teaching. We're going to set up our system and how we're acknowledging students, how we're acknowledging staff who are implementing correctly, or even providing some error correction for folks. But then we're also going to come up with some different strategies of how we're responding to problem behavior differently. And we're going to use our data as we're going to progress monitor and for that continual improvement process. But what you're going to see is that we're going to mix this up a little bit today. Because as you can see, database decision-making, I just mentioned that as the very end. However, you're going to see database decision-making is part of this process all the time. So we need data to determine what are we doing at tier 1. Why do we want to implement tier 1? What is it that we need to select as part of our tier 1 practices? But then we need data to determine, are we implementing that correctly? How is our system going to change to support these practices that we've set up? And then you're using that data in that continual improvement process along the way. So, and it doesn't hurt to always revisit your vision and expectations throughout the process. So even when you do get this up and established, I always say to folks, go back and double check, because even though you came up with this system of how you were acknowledging kids, or you came up with your school-wide expectations, it doesn't mean it's time to edit it. We evolve over times. Our needs of our students sometimes change over time. Our needs of our teachers, and based upon the infrastructure and the system we've set up on our school campuses, change over times, and we need to adapt with that and respond accordingly. And that's that piece where the data are always helping us along the way. If you have not had a chance to check out the PBIS Apps website, so the PBIS Apps, this is something you can go there. If you click on the PBIS assessment, you can enter either the benchmarks of quality or the TFI directly on there. That piece is free, and it would give you instant graphs. But there's also a lot of other information on the PBIS Apps website to help with the teaching aspect, to give you different things to think about, and using data for decision making as well. So using that data to guide intervention and instruction. So this problem solving process. So when we talk about tier 1, we're talking about typically what's in the green category on the triangle. But what's deceiving about that is that makes it think like, oh, it's only kids in the green that get tier 1 supports, and therefore others get other things. If you're in the yellow or you're the red, you get other things. And what's important to know is that tier 1 means all. So when we're talking about using data to guide intervention and instruction, we need to know how things are working across all at tier 1, which means all students. It means all adults, which could be the teachers, the staff. How are all of our families responding? Are they coming to our school events? Are they, following the pickup line procedures at, dismissal time? But you're talking about all. But then there's times we know that some folks need a little bit more support for one reason or another. So that's where that problem solving process comes in. Again, you're defining what's the problem, looking at that, analyzing it, coming up with the hypothesis, and basically saying, what are we going to do? Try it out. And then you're going to use your data to evaluate it and kind of say, did this work? Then that next piece is, let's take it out and let folks know. But from this process of kids getting, say, needing tier 2 supports or needing tier 3 supports, they're still part of the tier 1 process because they are part of the all. The difference is the data were showing that they need more intensive supports. That's all. So that's the piece that I think is hugely important. Classrooms fall into the same category. So if you're thinking about how do I implement tier 1, get started across my entire school, you got to think about all of your classrooms. What are all classrooms going to be implementing and supporting across the board? Yes, some classrooms based on who might be in the classroom or the levels of years of instruction for the teacher or their training might vary, and which might mean there's different supports that you have to provide for some of your different classrooms. But all classrooms, there may be an expectation for how you want teachers to be supporting students. And you're using these data to help you determine how are we going to action plan? What is it that we need to do? So if you've got few students that say they're having most difficulty, they're part of your tier 1, they continue to have access to tier 1, they continue, but they need more supports. Looking at that data to determine what else do they need? You know, is it more social skills? Is it problem solving, like conflict resolution stuff? Is it friendship making? You know, those types of things. That's using your action plan for that and using your data to determine who you're identifying in that process, how you're going to provide them support, and then how is that support going? How are the students responding to that intervention? Same is true as if you have a couple of teachers, you've decided to send them to additional training. You're going to be looking with that action planning to say, how is it working? Are they being able to take the new information and apply it within their classroom? And are you starting to see some positive outcomes? What other supports might be needed? So that's that piece where you're looking at your data and you're going through that 4-step problem solving process, saying, how can I identify the needs? You know, what is it that we're working towards? How can I understand the barriers? Let's analyze what's going on. Why aren't we having stronger responses to this? Providing sufficient information, we've got to implement, and then we've got to evaluate to determine how effective we are in anything that we do. This is an example of some of the key questions and infrastructure across that continuum of support, where we're looking at decision rules of moving in and out of tiers, because again, tier 1 means all people, okay? Nobody is exempt in this process. So if you're looking and starting at the bottom, you're saying, like, is it working for all? So whatever it is that you're doing on your campus, is it working for everybody? Is everybody having positive outcomes? If they're not, then you start to think about, okay, what services are being delivered? Are they evidence-based? Are they with Fidelity? Who's receiving those services? But it's so important that we have an idea of using our data to determine, is our system working overall? You know, what are the decision rules that we have to determine that it's not working? What are the expectations that we have overall for our students, for our teachers? That starts getting into the practices piece that also starts getting into how you're setting up your system to best support PBIS on your school campus or across your district. And some of this stuff may, if you're brand new to PBIS, might start to make more sense as we get into the practices piece and get into the systems piece in the next 2 sessions. One of the things you can also, I think it's always important for data, regardless of what data that you're looking at, you essentially want to know, are behaviors improving? Are behaviors holding steady? Are behaviors getting worse? Okay, so that can start to help you determine right there, what would our decision rules be? So if behaviors are getting worse, well, what is it that we expect overall? that could be some of your basic decision rules right there. We expect, that all students would not be sent to the office, or maybe they're only sent to the office one time throughout the entire year, let's just say. Well, that's for a basic baseline right there that you can look at. So then you could say, okay, then how many of our students are actually following this, or are we having bigger issues? So that's going to help you start to mine down even further. Why is this happening before you can start to even come up with and say, what is it that we need to do differently? So questions for consideration is to what data are needed to assist us in making meaningful and efficient decisions? Are there additional data that could help us? And if yes, what type? And what will we need in order to begin using data regularly for decision-making during our team meetings? Because when you're using the problem-solving process across the continuum of support, I want you to think about tier 1 is about what does everybody need? And that's going to be the big takeaway. And like I said, I started to dabble a little bit in talking about tier 2 and tier 3, and you'll start to hear that come up a little bit throughout this entire strand. But really the focus of this strand is about getting started at tier 1. And so I want you guys to think about, what do all need across your school, or across all of your schools if you're district level, or across all of your districts if you're state level. And then go through and say these questions. What data are needed to assist us in making these decisions? Are there additional data that could help us? Why would they help us? And what do we need to begin using data regularly? So consider the database decision-making capacity of your system that you have right now. A bunch of you guys did say that you are engaging in some type of data decision-making throughout the school year. But do your data analysts have full access to the data? Or do they have to request, and do they have to know what they need to be requesting to make decisions? Within 5 to 10 minutes of start of the meeting, are your teams reviewing up-to-date precision problem statements developed by your data analysts? Are they going to help us identify that if-then statement? So, we haven't taught students what the procedures are in the cafeteria. Chances are that's probably why kids are bumping into each other, and then why we have fights. Again, are they starting to look through and start to come up with some ideas of why there's problems occurring? And are your teams able to develop a complete action plan to help address a specific problem that is coming up in 10 minutes or less? So just think about that. If you're not, there's other kinds of resources we can help connect you to, but you've got to start first with some type of data and to be gathering people around the table, talking about that data and saying, what are we going to do next in order to start developing an action plan? So, Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you here to talk about how things were on the poll. I'm going to take a look at the chat. I've seen the exemplars have been typing away like crazy. So, and I'm going to mute.
Yeah. I'm going to share. I was able to pull up the results. And while I do that, I just want to highlight in that last slide that Heather was sharing, she's, the prompt is, well, what are your teams doing if they don't have those systems for analyzing data instead? And I always like asking that question when we're working with schools and districts. A lot of time teams get together and they enjoy each other's company, which is great. They perseverate on what's not going well in the school. Maybe they're planning parties and celebrations. And those have components of importance. But teacher time is so precious. So the efficiency and the effectiveness of our team meetings really needs to be attended to. And those prompts on that previous slide, I think, help with that. They speak to this idea of, when we sit down, do we already have our data analyzed? And can we spend our team time talking about what to do about the data, for example? And is it accurate? And are we able to make decisions? I would say, when a problem's presented, can we get to a solution in 10 minutes? Before my work with PBIS, I would have thought that was not realistic. And now we actually have some pretty good researched models to show how to do that, which is pretty awesome. So you were asked to look at these polls. Let me make sure I can pull it up. Let's have to share one more time. Give me 1 second here. Let me share. Let's see if that comes through. All right, a little hard to see. Let me try to make it bigger. All right, so it's hard to see on your screens, I think, because I'm looking at a secondary view myself. So let me tell you what I'm seeing. What we're looking for in these questions, these 4 questions about data and decision making, is we're trying to grow the blue, essentially. So do you have a leadership team that reviews accurate and up-to-date data, behavioral data monthly? And right now, about a quarter of you. The thinking here is, do we have a process where we're organized, and each month at least one of our monthly meetings, we're able to break down the data and make quick decisions about it. When I first started doing this work, my very first school team we had 20 participants. We were a very small residential school. We had 20 team members, which is almost untenable. And we would just bring the data, we would sort of swim in it in our meetings. And we'd spend a lot of time kind of looking at data. It wasn't the best use of our time. We didn't know it then. But analyzing in advance actually made a big difference. So for that first question, 24%. The next question, decision making. Our leadership team develops data-based action plans to address behavioral needs and monitors each plan monthly. So that's at about 17% of you said that you have a decision-making process in place. The next question, which is the fidelity. Our leadership team regularly assesses fidelity of teachers' discipline practices and of our PBIS implementation, like the system itself. And we're about 5%. So I find this to be very common. I'm sure of the hundreds of folks who are listening in today, many of you probably have implemented PBIS in some level of fidelity in the past, or your school has been doing it for a long time, for example. And then if you had called Heather or myself and said, we're having trouble, the first question we probably would ask you is, what's your current fidelity of implementation? And the reality is most folks don't know when they're in your situation because they're not actually measuring it. We have a way to answer the question, are we implementing PBIS the way we're supposed to? And that's this tiered fidelity inventory. So this question sort of answers itself in a way. It's item 1.14 on the tiered fidelity inventory. And if you're doing the inventory, you would at least be able to answer this one positively. So that's a great way to start. Maybe before you even get into the where do we go next, let's take a baseline and figure out where we're currently at with what we're doing for our tiered PBIS supports. And then finally, an evaluation plan. And I saw this one was again about a quarter of you said, yep, we have this in place. And for that group, I would want to dig a little bit deeper and to say you have a plan that's been informed for at least once a year that speaks to your system for supporting the social, emotional, behavioral wellness of your students and your school's climate and culture. And that plan includes action steps. What are our goals for next year? Where do we want to get to? So the quality of the evaluation plan may be something to consider. And even in this case, even if you said it's fully in place for any of these, you can always look at that quality of that item and consider, but what else can we do to make this more effective and efficient for us? So that's where we're currently at with the fidelity, the polls. I'm going to share my other screen, and let's now transition maybe to sort of action planning and question and answer. And while I share that slide, it's probably just going to come up as, it'll be easier for me if I just show it as the whole PowerPoint deck. This might be a time for Therese or Diane or Brian to maybe, if you want, if you could come off mute and maybe you could talk a little bit about what are some common questions that you heard in chat, or what questions might we want to speak to as a group. We have about 10 minutes left here. Yeah, let me switch over my screen.
Hey, Brian, this is Therese.
Hi, Therese.
I thought that we had some really, really good conversations going on in the chat area. I think maybe one of the biggest conversations, at least from my perspective, was a conversation about data consistency. And do we have consistency? Do we use data if it's inconsistent? And that sort of a thing. Do you or Heather have any recommendations or thoughts about that issue?
Yeah, so that is very common among schools. When we're talking about discipline data, for example, you might find that when you're getting your staff organized, how do we see behavior similarly? How do we document the behavior we see? You might be a school that has an increase in documented discipline problems, for example. So being consistent with staff might mean, oh, actually, we're going to see the numbers tick up because now we're documenting what we see a little bit more. And I think I'm curious to hear what Heather says, but my regular message around this is data integrity and data consistently should be a continuous focus of your PBIS teams for as long as they exist. So you might put a substantial work into that this year, getting your teachers to say, what do we consider disrespectful behavior and what's not disrespectful? And let's be consistent with how we document it, for example. But you can't just do that one time and expect 5 years from now your teachers are still documenting it consistently. You would need to come back to that on a regular basis and show teachers their own data and ask those questions. Heather, how would you respond to that question about the data consistency and suggestions for focusing on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is it's a great goal to have, and it's something we always want to strive, and just know that we're also human, and there's always going to be that human error that occurs. And so the key that's going to be is, are you looking at that data, and when there seems to be things that don't quite match, whether if it's an office discipline referral, say that's not filled out completely, rather than I think us going, oh, you need to fill it out again, we actually need to follow up with that person who filled it out and just say, hey, we need to talk about how it needs to be filled out. And hopefully then they're able to see, oh, this is why needs to be filled out this way, because you guys are using it for certain things. And so hopefully that connection is made. But just know that it is going to be a continual improvement process, because there are so many people involved with that data piece. And I know that there's a ton of kids and there's a ton going on throughout the day. So, and we are human. So keep in mind that as long as you're continuing to look at it, and there's a way that people don't start getting scared of data and thinking like, data is that bad 4-letter word type of thing, but that data actually, we need feedback too. And it's that performance feedback. And we need to know when we're doing it correctly, but we also need to know if we filled something out incorrectly too. So I'd like you to say like, yes, work to make sure that it's consistent. And I think that's always a goal to have, but just know at times that there's still going to be some errors. Hopefully it's a small standard deviation in that, because we are human, as long as we're continuing to keep up with it.
And Heather, that consistency is key. We saw early on in the chat some questions and comments around major and minor problem behaviors. And, you know, that a few comments came up about some people are just tracking minors and some people are just tracking majors and some are doing both. And so it's that consistency, getting everyone on that same page. You know, that might go back to the development of that T-chart that really spells out very clearly office managed or major behaviors versus minor classroom teacher managed behaviors, and getting everybody on that same page and having that consistency and that common understanding makes such a huge difference in the you know, the data that you're collecting. And you want a really great clean data, and we just have to have everybody on that same page. So it really kind of goes back to one of those components of the development of a T-chart.
Another thing that I'm seeing in chat was this kind of conversation we're all engaged in, and you know, does PBIS use a root cause analysis for database decision making? I think I would take a step back from all of that and ask the question of your schools: do we have a database decision making process, and what is our process, and are we doing that process with Fidelity? So on the slide, I'm going to pull it up here, the slide that Heather shared. Define, analyze, and evaluate. 4-step process. And if a school is doing this, they're relying on their data and they're coming up with a plan and implementing it at their team meetings, or planning to implement it and then implementing it and then evaluating, did it work? That school's in great shape. Most schools without a formal process that they are focusing on and providing some PD for Fidelity, they have problems and they talk about solutions, and they just talk. The problems aren't defined with precision. There's no data necessarily. There's a feeling of, boy, it feels like the parents are pretty unhappy with our recent decision about our bus schedule after schools. Okay, that's a primary problem statement. But PBIS really encourages you to look at the precision of those statements. Turn that into data that you can specifically tie and you can connect it to, and then what the process you're going to use. So this one on the screen, I think, is a great example. You might have heard of team-initiated problem solving. That's another database decision-making process, and they have something very similar to this as well. Again, whatever you pick, I would say, are you providing training to your teams on using data for decision-making? And then are you staying with them and helping them do it in a way that is a Fidelity? We have a couple more minutes here. Anybody else? Brian, Therese, Diane, any other questions that have come up? I'm looking through some of the chat here as well to see if anything else pops out.
I just see, Brian, a recent a comment about clip charts. Our school is still a clip chart school. So I don't know, Brian, you're pretty good at addressing that. You want to say a little something about that? We talk about that a lot during team training.
Yeah. How about we save that for practices?
Okay. Yeah.
Which is coming up next, because I know I trust in teachers. I know why they decide to use clip charts. They probably have the best of intentions. They're trying to do what they think is right for students. And let's honor teachers and say, okay, if we can do better than that, let's teach them what that might be first, so we can give them some good replacement strategies. But I think that that's part of what we'll get into next with practices, is how now should adults take advantage of this data that we're organizing and use that data to inform what practices will help students achieve the social, emotional, and behavioral success we want. So I like that setup, Diane. I think you're trying to get me to get on with just 3 minutes left here, is what I really think. So anyway, you know what though, we didn't mention, I don't think we mentioned like assertive discipline or shaming strategies or things like that in our section that's coming up next. But feel free to bring that out in chat for those of you who are going to be here after the break, and we'll jump into that toward the end. So I'm looking at the time here. It's almost a quarter to the hour. This would be a great time if you haven't already. If you could look on the Pathable page, you'll see the survey link. Oops, I'm scrolling way too far. Let me find it. I'm going to put up a slide as well. And we would greatly appreciate it. How's that going to work? I'm making it a little too big. I'm trying to look at my screen down here. Hopefully you can see the scan me. I'm not sure. I don't know how well that'll work. I'll zoom in on that. How about that? But it's also in Pathable. So in the Files tab, you can click on the evaluation link. On the card itself, under our names, under C1, you can see the survey. Your feedback is really important. We'd like to do that for each of the sections today. So how did you feel about what you learned today regarding data, this big overview idea, just getting you started, and let us know. And then what we're going to do is we're all going to take a half-hour break. I think it's a half hour. I have to double check.
It is.
Okay. I should have looked at that. I have looked at that many times. A half-hour break. We're going to come back at a quarter past the next hour for wherever you are in the world. And we're going to talk about practices next. Okay.
And
Heather, anything else before we wrap up?
yeah, I just want to say the very last slide on the handout is there's actually 3 different links there. So we've got the National Center, obviously, but then there's the Florida Project as well as Midwest PBIS. So different things that we had talked about from both Brian, Diane, and the rest of Brian and Therese. You can find it at one of these 3 spots, and our contact information. Again, if you have a specific follow-up you want to talk to any of the exemplars, their emails were located on the slide that introduced them, and then Brian's and my contact information is on that very first intro slide as well. But we're looking forward to seeing you guys in C2 in a half hour, and we'll have even additional exemplars. So a huge thank you to Therese, Brian, and Diane for your expertise and answering questions along the way and sharing your trade secrets with folks. And we have it all recorded, so which is good. Enjoy your break, everyone.
Thank you,
We'll see
everybody.
you at the next one. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
I'm going to go ahead and close this all out. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
Thanks, you
Lauren.
guys. Thank
Cool.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lauren.